I'd like to continue our discussion of the four superkingdoms of the domain Eukarya today. Last time we began talking about the group known as the Excavata, and I want to continue that discussion today. So as we look at the superkingdom Excavata, we talked a little bit about the diplomonids last time. I probably went on and on about the Giardia in that module. And so I want to move on today to another kingdom that we find within the Excavata, and those are the Hypermastigophora. And so what the word Hypermastigophora is telling us is that the suffix ophora means to bear, masti is a reference to flagellae, and hyper means many. And so this is kind of an unusual group in that they have lots and lots of flagellae. Normally when we're looking at flagellated eukaryons, they usually have 2, 3, maybe 4 flagellae. But as you can see, this group will have dozens and dozens of flagellae. And also typical of the group, they lack mitochondria, and so they tend to form symbiotic relationships with animals and live within animals. So within the Yellowstone ecosystem, this is a significant group because all of the herbivorous mammals, the big mammals that we like to look at, really depend on hypermastigophorans as well as some of the eubacterians as well to digest the vegetation for them. And I think I've talked about this a little bit before as well. So, the bison, deer, elk, bighorn sheep, all of these organisms that are herbivorous animals in the Yellowstone ecosystem are dependent upon grasses for food, yet we lack the enzyme to really efficiently digest those grasses. And also, I would also include the termites here. So termites also will have lots of the Hypermastigophora living in their gut. So again, it's kind of a problem in that you have these animals that are feeding on vegetation, and there's a lot of sugar tied up in the cell wall of these organisms. And you may recall that the plant cell wall is composed largely of cellulose, and cellulose is 100% glucose. But the problem here is that the arrangement of glucose and cellulose is slightly different. The bonds between the glucoses are slightly different than what we see in starch. So looking at starch here, they have one type of bond between the sugars, and you'll notice that the cellulose has a different series of bonds holding the sugars together. So animals lack the enzyme necessary to break the bonds between the sugars in cellulose, but the Hypermastigophora do produce those. And what's also kind of interesting is that the Hypermastigophora themselves don't actually have those enzymes, but living in the cytoplasm of the Hypermastigophorans are eubacterians that can break these bonds. So this is a symbiotic relationship that's really a three-way relationship. Living in the guts of the bison, elk, deer, and so on are the Hypermastigophora, and then living within the cytoplasm of the Hypermastigophora are the eubacteria. And so food is eaten by the animal, it's macerated, chewed up, and then these Hypermastigophora will phagocytize those, take those into their cells, and I'm going to talk about phagocytosis in a couple of minutes. But they'll take those into their cytoplasm, these little granules of wood or grasses, and then the bacteria inside of their cells will digest the cellulose to sugars that will feed the Hypermastigophorans. Some of those sugars leach out into the intestinal lumen of the animal and then get into the bloodstream of the animal. So what's kind of interesting then is that the young animals, bison, elk, deer, and so on, they actually have to seed their intestine with these Hypermastigophorans and the bacteria as well. And so, as they feed and nurse on their mothers, typically there'll be fecal contamination there, and so they'll pick it up that way. But sometimes you'll see, newly born animals literally, eat their mother's feces, and students will just be grossed out by that sometimes. But the point is, what they're trying to do is seed their intestine and get these organisms in their intestine so they can transition from drinking mother's milk to feeding on the grasses. And if they didn't do that, if their intestine stayed sterile, they would starve to death eventually. So again, this is a really important aspect to having the young picking up these bacteria and Hypermastigophora from their mothers in one way or another through fecal contamination. Okay, now another of the four major superkingdoms that I want to move into next is the superkingdom SAR. And characteristics of the SAR is that some of them will have, those that have chloroplasts will have what we call tetramembranous chloroplasts. So you may recall that a typical chloroplast has two membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and members of the SAR will actually have 4 membranes associated with the chloroplasts. Most or all will exhibit a flagella or cilia. Some will have what we call hairy flagella, so kind of branching flagellae, so that's unusual. And then some will have, and actually here's an example of that, so they're kind of brushy looking flagellae. And then some will also have invaginations of the cell membrane, and these are known as alveoli. And so again, not all members will have this, but some will. And then some will exhibit pseudopods, and this is a way, and amoebas would be an example of this. Amoebas have a very flexible membrane, and that's going to be actually the first group that we talk about here. So the first kingdom within the SAR that I want to talk about are the Rhizopoda, and Rhizopoda are pretty common in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And the Rhizopoda are the classic amoebas. And looking at an amoeba, they have a very, very flexible membrane, and I'm going to show you a video of this in a second, but they can constantly change shape. And they will surround and ingest organic matter or small organisms and then digest those intracellularly within their cell. So this ability to consume organisms, wrapping their membrane around and consume it, we call that phagocytosis, which means cell eating. So I'd like to show you a little animation demonstrating phagocytosis first. And so you can see that the cell membrane surrounds a piece of organic material and brings that inside the cell. And then once inside the cell, that material can be digested. Now, looking at a rhizopoda, I want to go ahead and show you an example of a rhizopodon as well. And so this is a typical amoeba. And you can see that amoebas have a cytoplasm that can stream forward. And so some of the cytoplasm can move, some of it cannot. And so the cytoplasm will change from kind of a liquid state to a more gelatinous state. The more liquid form we refer to as cytosol and also cytogel, although here it's referred to as ectoplasm and endoplasm. But they have the same kind of proteins that we have in our muscles, and so again, they can change the texture of their cytoplasm from being kind of rigid, as when we flex our muscles, or soft, as when our muscles are not relaxed. So the shape of an amoeba then is constantly changing. And again, they can surround prey items or just organic material that they come across and then ingest that, bring that into the cell. And some of them are pathogenic. So there are lots of free-living amoebas in the Yellowstone ecosystem. You'll find them in almost any body of water. So again, they practice this process of phagocytosis. But two of the common genera that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, one would be the genus Amoeba. And amoeba, again, are just kind of classic free-living amoebas. We'll find those living in ponds and lakes and streams throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem. There are a number of other genera that we would consider free-living amoebas like this. And then there's also a very unusual pathogenic form of an amoeba that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and that's the genus Naegleria. And Naegleria historically has been kind of associated with tropical regions, but we do find it in a few odd places in the United States. You'll find it in some areas of Lake Powell and a few other lakes in Arizona. And also we find Naegleria in a few of the hot springs up in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So there are some hot springs that people like to go in that aren't too hot. And one of the things you have to be careful of is Naegleria. And so what Naegleria can do is if you get Naegleria up into your nasal passages, in the upper portions of your nasal passages, they like nervous tissue. And so they'll actually work up through the olfactory nerves up into the brain, and it literally eats the brain. And there's really no cure for Naegleria once you get it. And unfortunately, people don't know they have Naegleria until they start showing neurological symptoms. And once you start damaging brain cells, you don't really regenerate those very well. So it is rare. And I'm not sure that anyone has ever been infected with Naegleria in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but they do report that Naegleria is found in the hot springs in Yellowstone. So again, you do have to be a little careful. It's fun to get in them, but you wouldn't want to get your head underwater. You certainly don't want to get, like I said, you certainly don't want to get that water up into the upper nasal passages, because again, they'll work their way up into the brain, the olfactory lobes, and damage the brain. Okay, another kingdom of SAR that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem are the foraminifera. Now, I'm mentioning them because they're kind of historically important. They're actually marine organisms. And of course, there are no seas in the Yellowstone ecosystem now, but there have been historically. So we find a lot of foraminifera actually in the sediments of the Yellowstone ecosystem. They have a shell of calcium carbonate that can be used for dating techniques. And also the living forms have non-rigid kind of soft pseudopods. Anyway, the foraminifera are important microfossils because they do fossilize readily, and so by looking at different sediments, you can actually date sediments based on the types of foraminiferans that you find. So in the modern ecosystem, they're not that important, but they do have some significance when we try to look at the evolutionary, or not evolutionary history, but as we try to look at the geologic history of the park and try to figure out what was going on in that park. So again, at times there have been seas covering the area. And so the foraminiferans, as I mentioned, produce these kind of a growing shell. They start off small and then keep adding sections to the shell, and their pseudopods then will extend out of pores that they have in this shell. So again, these fossilize, these form microfossils, and we can date sediments based on that. And here's another view of the shell of a foraminiferan. Okay, now another group which is not tremendously important in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but is around, would be the kingdom Apicomplexa. And the Apicomplexans take their name from the fact that they have what we call an apical complex. Now, this is a group where the members, again, are all obligate intracellular parasites. So they have to live within other organisms for most of their life cycles anyway. And so an example would be malaria. It's probably, in terms of a global example, malaria is certainly not a problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem. It used to be endemic to the United States, but is no more. And here's an example of looking at an apicomplex. And again, they have this apical complex, which will get them into a cell. Now, again, they're really not a significant pathogen to humans in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but certainly they are common pathogens. Almost every insect will have some kind of an apicomplexan parasite, which can affect their populations. Even some reptiles and amphibians occasionally may have these infestations. So they're around, they're there. Again, they're parasitic. Many of them are not extremely parasitic or pathogenic. They don't necessarily cause devastating diseases, but some have the potential to do that. So I do want to mention them somewhat in passing because almost, like I said, almost every organism, every species will have some kind of apicomplexan which can take advantage of them under certain conditions. Okay, now a very, very common kingdom is the Coleophora, and we just refer to them as the ciliates. And so the Coleophora bear cilia. So these are organisms, mostly unicellular, that have cilia and can swim with cilia. An example is Paramecium, but there are many, many other examples. So again, they have cilia which cover their surfaces. They'll swim around. As they swim, they'll move materials into what was referred to as a oral groove or gullet, and then they'll phagocytize what they concentrate there. Other forms may attach to a surface and then filter feed what happens to be in the fluid. So again, throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem, you'll find lots of ciliates, ponds, streams, rivers, and even some of the hot springs will have some ciliates. And so let me show you again a video or two, looking at some examples here. So this first one is of a Paramecium. And so when ciliates are swimming, they usually have a nice smooth movement to their swimming. It's not herky-jerky. Flagellated organisms usually have kind of a herky-jerky motion, but again, there are lots of cilia covering the surface there. And then another example, and this is Vorticella, the genus Vorticella. It's going to come up for us. And Vorticella is one that we actually find in some of the hot springs. And Vorticella, as you can see, have a stalk-like structure at their base. And they usually attach to a surface and then filter feed, although they can detach and swim as well. But you can see they have a ciliated ring around their mouth, and they'll bring tiny organisms into that oral groove and feed on them. So again, in ciliates, then some swim, some filter feed, but they do essentially take materials out of the water, and mostly fresh water. Okay, Eugleinophita would be another one that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and these are small unicellular algae, so these are photosynthetic organisms. And Eugleinophita are pretty ubiquitous, again, in freshwater ecosystems. You'll find them throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem in almost every body of water. Now, one other thing I want to mention about the Eugleanophyta is that there are a couple of things. One is that although they are photosynthetic, they are what we describe as being facultative heterotrophs. So they do have the capacity under certain conditions to be heterotrophic. So if there's not enough light, they can be heterotrophic. Also under certain conditions, you see that they are flagellated. They will spit out that flagella under certain conditions, and they can not really be amoeboid, but they can kind of crawl around almost like a worm, if you will, but somewhat like an amoeba, and don't have to swim necessarily. So again, they're kind of an interesting organism and ubiquitous around the world in freshwater. Okay, the Bacilaurophyta are the diatoms. Diatoms are a very diverse group. Again, these are unicellular algae, so these are photosynthetic organisms, carry out plant-like photosynthesis. And you'll find them in almost every body of water around the world. There are freshwater diatoms, there are marine diatoms as well. And there's tremendous diversity within the diatoms. They have a test or a shell that's composed of silicon compounds, and so their shells are very glass-like. And what's kind of interesting about the diatoms is that when they do reproduce, they have shells that fit together kind of like a Petri plate. There's an upper and lower valve or shell to this. And when they carry out their mitosis, the shells will separate, and they always build in a smaller shell. So what's kind of interesting then, as they go through different generations, they will continually get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as they do this process. And eventually what will happen is that the organisms get so small that they undergo a sexual process, and then that will regenerate them to normal sizes. Now, the next kingdom I want to talk about are the Pyrophyta, which are dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates is a group that we normally think of as being a marine organism. However, some dinoflagellates are found in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And the dinoflagellates, what that name means is that as they swim, they spin. And so again, these are normally marine organisms. Many of them are bioluminescent as well, although the ones in the Yellowstone ecosystem, from what I understand, are not. And that's also why their official name, the Pyrophyta, means fire algae or fire plants, and that's partly due to their bioluminescent capabilities. And so they have a transverse flagellum and a longitudinal flagellum, and that's what produces that kind of spinning, swimming motion. And here's another look at a dinoflagellate. Another group that we find up there, again, a mostly unicellular algae. Occasionally you'll find some colonial forms of this, or the Chrysophyta. And again, this is a photosynthetic group of organisms, so plant-like photosynthesis. And again, mostly colonial forms. And again, we'll find this throughout the ecosystem. Another one that is not tremendously abundant in the ecosystem, but we find in the soils, are the Oomycota. Oomycota, and here the suffix of the word Oomycota is a reference to fungi, but these are not true fungi, but they're fungus-like. And again, these are mostly soil organisms. And we use some of the same terminology that we use when we talk about the fungi. They grow in filaments, so the cells will grow in continuous filaments. And we refer to these filaments as a hypha. Hypha would be singular, plural would be hyphae. And so we just add an E to the word for the plural. And then also we refer to the entire mass of hyphae then as the mycelium. So when we describe a fungus and we're looking at a fungus, we describe that as a mycelium, and the mycelium is composed of individual filaments, which are called hyphae. Now, again, the Oomycota are also called water molds, but again, they're mostly soil fungi. You do find them in water, or excuse me, soil organisms, although we do find them in water as well. They're decomposers or saprobes. They feed on dead organisms for the most part, but there are some pathogenic forms as well. And although this is really not problematic in the Yellowstone ecosystem, it is present in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and is the genus Phytophthora. And Phytophthora is really a notorious group of Oomycota. It's responsible for what's known as the potato blight, which originally led to the migration of a lot of Irish individuals to America back in the 1800s because of the potato blight there. And then also in other parts of the country, it causes oak blight. And it also is problematic agriculturally around the Yellowstone ecosystem because it causes alfalfa blight. So this Phytophthora group is present in the ecosystem. It doesn't seem to be particularly problematic for the native species in the ecosystem, but for the agricultural areas, it is problematic. And then lastly, another group I want to get to is this is not really a kingdom. There are actually 3 kingdoms that we describe as being slime molds. And slime molds, again, at one time were thought to be fungi, but they actually are not true fungi. And as the name suggests, they're kind of slimy in appearance. And in the Yellowstone ecosystem, they're mostly cellular slime molds. Cellular slime molds always have their cellular integrity. But another type of slime mold are acellular slime molds. And acellular slime molds, in certain conditions, in their non-sexual conditions, do not actually maintain individual cells. And I'll show you what they do here in just a second. But what the 2 forms do have in common is that under certain conditions, they will form these fruiting structures, they will form spores, and that's part of their life cycle. So they do exhibit some kind of interesting behaviors at certain stages of their life cycles. But again, this is a group that's mostly decomposers, what we call saprobes, feeding on dead and decaying organisms. So I do want to show you real briefly here in the acellular slime molds what they look like. And the acellular slime molds will form what we call a plasmodium. And this plasmodium is basically like a giant amoeba. They actually will just be masses of protoplasm. The actual membranes break down, and it's just a multinucleate protoplasmic mass. And you can actually, in some cases, see the protoplasm streaming and flowing, just like you would flowing within an amoeba. And so these can be pretty big. Sometimes they're brightly colored. These are more typically going to be found in wet deciduous forests as opposed to some of the drier coniferous forests which we see up in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, next I want to move into our next super kingdom. And I also just want to make a comment that we are spending a lot of time talking about some microscopic organisms. I know you're anxious to get to the big things. But I think it is important to understand that, without all of these tiny microorganisms at the base of the food chain and making up that portion of the food chain, there wouldn't be the big things that we get excited about seeing, like the bison and elk and grizzly bears and things like that. So I think it is important as we talk about the ecosystem to understand that there are all these microorganisms there, and that they are, in many cases, the base of the food chain, and the upper parts of the food chain in many cases are built upon them. Also, they recycle so many nutrients that are crucial to the ecosystem. Okay, so the next super kingdom I want to discuss are the Uniconta, and members of the Uniconta tend to have a single flagellum when present. They are all heterotrophic, and most are multicellular. And the 2 kingdoms here that we'll be considering, first is the kingdom Fungi, and then also the kingdom Metazoa, which are the animals. And fungi will include things like mushrooms, morels, puffballs, and others. And then, as I said, we'll also be considering the kingdom Metazoa, which are the animals. Now, the animals we're going to be discussing much later. We'll come back to the animals at a later time, but I do want to begin here discussing the fungi, because we do see lots of different fungi in the ecosystem, and again, they're really important in recycling nutrients. So again, we'll eventually come back to the animals. Now, as we look at the kingdom Fungi, what distinguishes the fungi from other groups is that they have a chitinous cell wall. So this material chitin, C-H-I-T-I-N, is probably best described as a nitrogenous polysaccharide. But it is a compound that we see in the fungi, and also animals produce chitin as well. And we also describe them as being absorptive heterotrophs. What that means is that they will secrete digestive enzymes, digest material outside their body, and then absorb the digested, or excuse me, outside the cells, and then absorb the digested nutrients through their cell wall and through their cell membrane. So they don't phagocytize materials because they have cell walls. So again, they have to secrete digestive enzymes, digest extracellularly, and then the nutrients diffuse into the cell. And most members of the fungi are multicellular. Exception to this would be yeasts. Yeasts are an example of a fungus, but they are an exception to this multicellularity. Now, as I mentioned, fungi tend to be saprobes or decomposers. Saprobe would be feeding on dead or decaying materials, mostly vegetation, but it could be animal tissue as well. Some forms are parasitic. And then also, there are a few that are predatory, although we don't see any of the predatory forms in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, when we talk about fungi again, they tend to grow in filaments. And so we describe these filaments as hyphae, and then the mass of the filaments we describe as a mycelium. And so again, as we look at an example here, again, the individual filaments would be a hypha, the plural of hypha is hyphae, the mass of the filaments would be a mycelium. So we're looking at a mycelium of a fungus here. Also, the mycelia can exist in, or excuse me, the hyphae can exist in three basic conditions. They can either be haploid, they can be dikaryotic, or they can be diploid. And in many cases, a particular species will exhibit all three of these forms at some point in their life cycles. So haploid hyphae then would have nuclei that are haploid. And so again, in certain stages of their life cycle, a fungus will be haploid. Under other conditions, those haploid hyphae may fuse together. And so they would be genetically different organisms fusing together. And so the individual cells would have nuclei from both of the parental fungi in them. And so we describe this as an N+N condition. So the nuclei stay separate, and so they would have both haploid nuclei within the cells of the hyphae. And so again, we refer to that as being a dikaryotic condition. And then our third condition would be diploid. So we do find fungi that are diploid. So if those two dikaryotic nuclei fuse together, we now have truly diploid nuclei, a nucleus, single nucleus that has two sets of chromosomes. So again, if you have a dikaryotic hypha, under certain conditions, those nuclei will fuse together, and then you have a diploid hyphae. So we're going to be looking at some different types of fungi in our next module. We'll be looking at some specific life cycles of fungi, and in some of those life cycles, we'll see that they move from being haploid in some situations to dikaryotic in other situations to truly diploid in other situations. So that'll be something that we come back to in our next module.